Welcome to day 2 of the Alliance for Community Media National Conference. I'm Mike Wassenaar, the President and CEO of ACM. I want to thank you for joining us here as we kick off day 2 with this plenary discussion about the future of localism and the role that community media centers and PEG channels can play to be able to meet the needs that we're seeing on the ground in communities across the country. We've assembled some people with some interesting perspectives to kick off the conversation, and then about halfway through this morning's discussion, we want you to be a part of the discussion. So we'll be asking for some questions and answers from you as we talk about the ways in which our organizations and new organizations that could be forming on the ground across the country can help to better inform Americans at a time that there's, I think it's fair to say there's a need for more local civic information. When academics have begun to identify that there are news and information deserts, really civic information deserts that exist across vast swaths of America. And in many cases, they're in communities that we already serve. As we look at exurban markets, not just, or even urban markets, where mainstream media is not really stepping up to meet the needs of providing information for all Americans. I think the question that I want to ask all of you assembled during the course of the conference is how we can make more meaning in the lives of the people that we serve in our communities. It's really sort of one of the core questions that we're trying to ask as we help you do better work, and then also as we look at how we define our work in the future. Before I introduce our guests this morning, I just want to note a couple quick things. If you are using social media, please use the hashtag ACMBmore, B-M-O-R-E. Hashtag ACMBmore during the course of today's discussion and then all through the course of the rest of the conference. Was yesterday a good day? Okay, I can tell the coffee's not quite working yet. Was yesterday a good day? All right, fine. All right. Well, let's see if we can make today a little bit better. Let's kick things off with our discussion with our guests here today. And please excuse me for standing up and taking a knee. I've got a chair here just to make sure that I'm not collapsing over the course of the discussion because I'm a little bit on the mend for my health. So joining me on my right to your left immediately is Melanie Sill. Melanie has been a leader in newsrooms and a change maker in executive roles at newspapers and at broadcast stations during the course of her career at the News and Observer in Raleigh, at the Sacramento Bee, at Southern California Public Radio, KPCC in Pasadena? Yeah. In Pasadena. And currently she's working as a consultant and as a thought leader working with organizations that are seeking to improve local news across the country, working with organizations such as the Institute for Nonprofit News, the Membership Puzzle Project, and others. She's based currently in North Carolina, working with the University of North Carolina Local Institute for Sustainability of Media, if I remember correctly, and as well as done some consulting work with the Democracy Fund. So please welcome Melanie to the stage. To her immediate right is Aziz Asham. Aziz is executive producer at BRIC, which is one of our member organizations in a little place called Brooklyn, New York. Aziz actually has a history of working with media organizations doing documentary work and content strategy, and he's a part of the award-winning production team at BRIC, and has an opportunity today to talk a little bit about the perspectives of what it means to be able to document the life of community in a place that's as diverse and exciting as Brooklyn. So please welcome Aziz to the stage. And then immediately to Aziz's right, far stage left, I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but maybe it's, I don't know, you can make your own judgments, is Teresa Gorman. Teresa joins us from the Democracy Fund, where she's a local news associate in the Public Square program, which is devoted specifically to to empowering and enlivening the public square in America to ensure that local news and local information helps our democracy to thrive. It's part of sort of the dual role that the Democracy Fund plays as a thought leader in building local information systems to be able to help our democracy, but then also to monitor the work across the country that's happening on the ground level. So she's got sort of a dual perspective here in terms of what works, what's fascinating, and maybe a little bit about what's ugly that she sees in the course of her analysis. And prior to that, she worked with the Local Law Project. Many of you may know that project through the Association of Independents in Radio and the great work that the visionary Sue Shart does in the Boston area. Sue was actually one of the speakers at the ACM Northeast Conference this last fall. So she had some experience working with community production organizations across the country, helping to tell the story of Americans at the local level. So she very much, I think, understands the need for those community stories to be told. So please welcome Teresa to the stage. So I just want to have a conversation with you kind of from far away. So it's not really kind of a round table. It's not as cozy as I'd like it to be, but so I'm going to try to make sure that I'm building some empathy as we're talking, as I'm here up at the podium. And I guess, you know, I want to start off the conversation with you, Melanie, but perhaps I can sort of broaden it as well to all three of you, and I can ask about, you know, what we're seeing in communities across the country with this so-called rise of media and information deserts. What exactly are we seeing?
Well, you know, it's kind of a Dickensian, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times situation. That's true in that we are seeing, and some of you represent new things, new responses to the eternal need that people want to know what's happening. And so I tend to tell people I'm an optimist on local news, and that news doesn't exist because of newspaper companies. News exists because people want to know what's happening, and people want to tell other people what's happening. But in terms of the News Deserts project that Penny Abernathy has led at the University of North Carolina and the Center for Innovation and Sustainability in Local Media, I work with them through my Democracy Fund work, but I'm not part of them. Things are getting worse. There is another round of data that will be released soon, and Penny's working on another book. But there was a preliminary that said, since 2004, at least 900 communities across the country have lost their news source, have become news deserts. And more than 1,800 newspapers have died or merged since 2004. Penny has found that 300 weeklies have started up in the same period, so that's a net loss of about 1,500 papers. Now, at the same time, we have seen a rise in digital news sites, and the Lion Group, which is local independent online news, they have a list of about 600 online news sites. As you know, online news sites often have very small staff, so replacing a newspaper with a news site is not a one-to-one. So overall, we've seen a net loss of local reporting. We've seen a lot of startup. We're seeing a lot of response in communities. You also have the reality that some kinds of information that flowed through newspapers in the past, now people can get through other sources. So it's something Clay Shirky said. Clay Shirky's I don't know how to sum him up, but he's a great thinker on many things. He said this about news, that nothing works, but everything might. And that's how I see it. I think that we're seeing a great shift in the commerce of news, and also in the response to the need for information in communities. And I'll stop there. There's a lot more. But one other thing I'll add before I stop is that local television, the Knight Foundation just released a five-part report on local television, which, as many of you know, in a lot of communities has been the top source of local news for a lot of people for some time. Local television is in a strong position financially. It's undergoing its own commercial change through consolidation and so on. And the Knight Foundation, I think, was trying to challenge local news as an important part of the news landscape because they're continuing to get political advertising and their revenues are strong, that they are in a position to do a lot more.
I don't know, Teresa, do you have the same kind of analysis of the best of times, worst of times metaphor that Melanie uses?
Sure. I really love that phrase. So I think we are seeing the same thing, that the local newspapers and the big institutions are weakening, and with that weakening, we've seen that there's been a correlation in the drop in civic engagement. There have been plenty of studies that show that when a community loses a newspaper, their civic engagement falls, or that show that community media or community storytelling projects create civic cohesion, and neighborhoods come together around that. So we see this big importance of that. So there's the negative, which sometimes we start with to get people to pay attention, but there's also the positive, because I think we are also saying that these local news institutions and ecosystems never truly served all of the communities that were part of them. So this is an opportunity that we see to take a new look, to not try to rebuild what was there before, but rebuild something new. And some of the things that Melanie mentioned, we're seeing all these new organizations pop up, and we're really seeing collaboration and working together as the future of local news and information, and thinking beyond the typical traditional organizations, and thinking about how we can work with community media and organizers and just people on the ground and citizens to come together to take this on. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
And I'm kind of curious. I mean, I think in the back of many of our minds, I mean, I know that for many of our organizations, we were founded with sort of I think what I would say is almost sort of a creed, that the idea that more local information, more expression helps to enliven democracy and helps to ensure that there's civic good and you have good civic outcomes. I think most of our organizations were founded with that principle in mind. We weren't necessarily founded with metrics in mind. Right? So, I mean, what you're saying, Teresa, is there's actually data that's now coming forward that talks about that correlation between the positive civic good that you see from that local information. I mean, and I guess turning it around, the negative impact of no local information. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, and it's always something that's really hard to measure. So often the studies you'll see are when something bad happens, and then researchers can take advantage of that to see what goes down. So I think often the research is negative, but we're also seeing some work happening around the growth of things like membership programs or new organizations, such as, for example, there's an organization called City Bureau in Chicago that has a really interesting program where they pay citizens to go to public meetings, and then the citizens report on these public meetings in collaboration with staff at City Bureau. And they've already done studies that the people that are involved in that are more civically engaged, they're more interested in what's going on around them, they're a positive force around people around them. So I think we're seeing a lot of little things like that, and what we need is kind of a bigger picture look. And one of the things that we do at Democracy Fund is just keep a constant look, and our job is to constantly be looking at all these little experiments and trying to make a bigger picture. So we do that with things like the Local Fix, which is our weekly newsletter. But I think that there's lots more to be done, and there's lots of things that we don't necessarily all know about. So I'm excited to hear from you all about some of that. And to your point about, I think, the organizations in the room that this was your creed, I think often that was seen as maybe revolutionary before, but now it's mainstream, or it should be mainstreamed, and we're trying to make it more part of everyday life and bring it into all different organizations. So it's exciting. You're light years ahead of a lot of organizations we work with in terms of that.
I mean, and I'm going to turn to Aziz in a moment or two, but I have to say that you're working in public radio, Melanie. I was in public radio for many, many years, and it's often hard to get the public in public radio, right, or public TV particularly. Yeah. And the other reflection I would have from partnering with PBS stations or NPR stations is they, I think, in many ways want to find a way to be in the place that your organizations already are. Right. With how to bring the public into the conversation. When in many respects, your organizations were founded on the entire idea of public conversation first. So it's kind of curious that kind of, in some ways, it's sort of back to the future for many of our organizations. I don't know, Melanie, you can talk a little bit about that maybe.
I wanted to, you had asked a question about the harm or the cost, and I also want to plug Theresa's newsletter, The Local Fix, that she and Josh Stearns put out at Democracy Fund. But recently, Josh put out a roundup of a number of studies that are starting to accumulate that document measurable harm of the loss of reporting, and in ways such as higher municipal borrowing costs for cities because of a lack of scrutiny of the bond deals that are being made. There's a scholar named Jay Hamilton, who was at Duke for years, who documented the actual financial returns of investigative reporting, and disease detectives, epidemiologists who track disease outbreaks. They rely on local media reports to tell them where things are happening. So you would be amazed at this list. It was probably 20 different academic studies that found measurable harm of the loss of journalism. And I think many of us in our own communities see things that aren't being covered. Internationally, countries that without strong media, corruption is much more rampant. And so those kinds of metrics people are starting to pay attention and measure. And then in public radio, I think what you said is true. There's a big effort to kind of now engage. It's kind of funny because having been outside public radio, when I went inside it, I thought, oh, really? The same issue is here. Like, how do you actually engage the public? So I think that you all should be up here kind of telling us some of the ways to do that. And I'm eager to hear from Aziz.
I mean,
also.
Another way to think about it is this is like your secret sauce, or your secret superpower. I mean, so you need to be thinking about capitalizing on your secret superpower and not make it so secret. And Aziz, go ahead.
I mean, just to dovetail on what Melanie was saying, the Columbia Journalism Review just came out with a report last week that said that even like baseline government costs get increased when local newspapers shut down. So when a city is fixing a pothole and they're, beforehand they would spend $200, now the contract goes to someone's cousin and they're spending $400. And so just on a very basic level, this actually affects every single taxpayer who lives in what was previously a news market that was served by local media and no longer is.
And I guess, as we think more broadly about our field too, I think that's probably a strange endorsement for government access television, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know that we actually specifically talk about this in quite those types of terms, is that the lower dollar costs go down as you provide more public information.
And there's a net gain to the taxpayer, right?
Right. So let me kind of be like a devil's advocate and maybe just kind of toss you a softball question, Aziz, before we talk specifically about Brooklyn. So, if I was a curmudgeon, I'm kind of a curmudgeon at times, but let's say I'm a critic. The American media system is for entertainment, right? Life is really hard enough on a daily basis. Most people, they're just happy to be entertained. And that's what our media system should be doing, right? It should be lightening the load because, you've got 3 jobs and you're hustling your ass off to be able to take care of your family. That's what our should be entertainment system. We have an entertainment system in America. That's what we should be doing. We should be making sure that, We're providing some relief. You know, how do you counter that kind of argument, even just on the basis of the work that you do on a day-to-day basis? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, life is hard.
Absolutely.
I think back to my academic days. It's like, if all you do is take medicine all the time, and that's what media is. Oh my God, yuck.
Yeah, you don't want just broccoli on your plate. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I think that as media makers, as producers, we are fundamentally storytellers, and journalism is based on storytelling, and especially the professionalization of journalism is based on storytelling. I think information obviously plays a massive role in that, but what we are finding is even in news deserts or communities that are less served by local, the information is not disappearing, right? People are still finding out who has a used tractor trailer to sell, right? They might not be finding it in a local newspaper. Maybe they're finding it on Craigslist or online elsewhere. People are still finding out what the weather is going to be. People are still finding out oftentimes, in Washington, D.C., and just like in New York City, there are a number of really active listservs, so I can go on and I can still get a lot of information. But journalism, I think, is a little bit different, because journalism is about entertaining as well, and it is about storytelling, and we try and incorporate both and make sure that there's like a well-rounded diet and a lot of things on your plate. Right?
Well, let's turn a little bit then to talk about the work in Brooklyn. Do you define your work as journalism?
Some of it, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think we do a lot of journalism, and we have journalists on staff. We also do a lot of entertainment. We do a live music show that I don't think, maybe in a very liberal sense of the word, you could define as having any informational value whatsoever. We do a live comedy show.
It probably has cultural value.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
But we do a lot of journalism. That's the majority, I think, of the in-house production that we do, I would call journalism.
We've got a bit of a little sizzle reel we want to share with people. We can talk a little bit about some specific examples here. So maybe we can roll that here, just so people get a brief taste of what we're talking about.
Can't let anybody know that you're scared out here, because I've been scared, but the minute somebody knows you're scared, it's almost like they've already won.
They did nothing for me, but just give me a debt of $32,000.
So why is there a target on you guys then? Why do you think it's negative?
You're asking some good questions, and I'm going to answer them, all right? The reason why is because we're doing such a good job.
You're doing such a good job that you got sued?
Remember, you're talking about a lawsuit that we won. So you can't talk about
a lawsuit that was settled.
No, it was not settled. We didn't pay anything, right? We didn't pay anything.
I have a couple friends, like I said, friends that got shot, friends that got hurt, stabbed up. They don't get to live to see 21.
When it happens to you, you realize nobody's immune from some of this stuff. It was time to begin to chip away at the shame and the stigma that is attached to the disease of addiction.
I'd rather them use clean needles than pick up a needle off the ground and use it.
The initial response was, what is the punishment and what's the sanction for this illegal drug use? And what I am trying to accomplish, the focus now is going to be on public health and not thinking solely about punishment.
We are in the arrivals at Terminal 1, just waiting for you and every person who you've been with for the last week to come through the doors. So is everyone in great spirits and happy and up and all that jazz?
Yeah, in every way.
Okay.
I'll see you on the other side then.
All right. See you soon.
Okay, awesome.
Bye.
So can you talk a little bit about some of the stories that you're alluding to there?
Sure. There are a lot up there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. You don't have to,
So we did a lot on the war on drugs, for example, and we did a unit. We do about 4 major units per year, and one of them recently was on the war on drugs and how that was affecting local communities in Brooklyn, especially communities of color, and. We did a documentary series, parts of which you saw up there. We did also a half-hour show. We looked at at a Hasidic community that was very impacted by addiction and how the stigma within that community was really becoming a barrier to solutions. We looked at some independent nonprofit organizations that were basically just going to places where they knew drug dealers were going to be shooting up and cleaning those places up. So basically creating improvised safe injection zones in places where they knew drug dealers would appear, providing clean needles and swabs and all of that stuff. And then we brought a number of thought leaders, as well as the nonprofits and activists, along with community partners, the Marshall Project, and someone else I can't remember, and a number of leading city officials like the district attorney, and we provided a forum where we invited 400 people from the community. We opened our doors into our theater. We're very blessed to have a beautiful theater in downtown Brooklyn, and to hold those elected officials accountable, where we also use the documentaries really to drive the conversation and say, like, hey, let's respond to these actual community needs. The people are here. You're on record. You're on camera.
So what you're saying is that the documentary work, the journalism work, would be setting up a deeper level of engagement project that happened at the site.
Yeah, often it does. Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of our documentaries are just one-offs where a local producer, a community producer, an independent, someone not on our staff or anything like that, will pitch an idea to us and say, hey, I think it's really valuable that we look at this local deli who has been family-owned for 300 years. Well, probably not that long, but and I just think we should do a 4-minute piece on this. So we also do a fair number of real, just like listening to community members tell the stories that they want, and then helping them tell the story really well. Yeah,
I mean, I remember seeing a short piece that you did of an elderly Hasidic man who was basically kind of doing his daily chores, right? Yeah. And I think the thing that I found that was really quite striking is that I got access to somebody's life that I did not know about. And I would think that for someone at the neighborhood level, it's extremely important to be able to understand your neighbors, to be able to have that type of cultural connection and the information connection with people that may not be in your circle.
Yeah, and I think that's what we hear all the time. It's probably what we hear the most, and I'm sure what most people in this room hear quite often is that people come to us and they say, we're the only people who are listening. We're the only people who listen to their story, right? Whether that story is something that they tell in our studio or it's something that we've gone out into the field and captured. No one else is hearing them, no one else is listening to their story, and I think that's really important, and that, ideally that's what a big part of local media, right?
Yeah. What types of organizations are doing innovation that you're seeing at the local level? I mean, maybe Teresa, you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, it's a broad range of groups that you're talking about, right? And you monitor like a really heterodox group of organizations. It's not just one type, and it's not just one place across America.
The easy answer would be all types of organizations are doing innovations. I think we're seeing some really interesting work happen across the country. We focus a lot of our observations in New Jersey, North Carolina, New Mexico, Chicago, and then a little bit as well just across the country. But we're seeing some really interesting mixes of things happen. So the nonprofit news organizations that Melanie mentioned, kind of dispersed throughout the country, are doing some really interesting kind of traditional reporting as well as engaging reporting. We're seeing these, one of my colleagues calls them new jacks. So individuals who see a need in their community and just start something up. They start a newspaper, they start a newsletter, they start a listserv, they respond to that one story that no one's listening to, and they start to do something. And then often they don't know how to build a business around that, so we try to help them with that work. We're also seeing a lot of really interesting collaborations and openness around opening up and rethinking processes and how to connect with communities. So, for example, a project called News Voices connects activists, community organizers, politicians, newsrooms, television stations all in a room together to talk about the big issues and to talk about how they can work together more. So we're seeing a lot of those examples. There's one example in Ohio called Your Voice Ohio, where 46 organizations came together to talk about the opioid crisis. And to respond to that question about, everything is dark and sad, and of course the opioid crisis is a terrible story, but rather than making everyone feel terrible, they came together and practiced what we call solutions journalism and thought, what can we do together to think of solutions to this? And that's a little that's very innovative for journalists to take that step, to say, what are solutions we can present to the community and community can present to us to work on together. So we're seeing all of this kind of happen everywhere around the country, and hopefully we're pairing it with innovations around business and revenue, and people have to eat. So how can we do these amazing projects that connect to community more, but also support organizations and people's livelihoods as well?
Yeah, that's a key challenge. You need to make sure you maintain talent at the local level. You need to have talent to be able to do this kind of work. And I think it's sort of a challenge that our organizations face, is thinking about how you grow talent, how you cultivate talent, and particularly I think in communities that may be economically challenged, how you keep young talent. There's a sort of story of intergenerational change that's happening across America, is how we make sure that young talent stays in community and stays in place, as opposed to going to New York, DC, and LA. Right? It's a huge challenge.
Massive problem, and if if local news does dry up, that is oftentimes the farm system for our media ecosystem, and you're just cutting out the bottom. And just think about how many of in whatever medium, whether it's newspaper or TV journalism, how many of the people that you look up to as being kind of leaders in the field got their start in local or got their start in community. It's probably most, if not all of them, right? Yeah. So that's a big problem.
Yeah, it ends up being a feeder system in many respects.
Absolutely.
Even if you're looking at people who don't necessarily stay in community, it ends up being an essential way to be able to build skills. And having those local newsrooms, having those local production houses, extremely important for the media ecosystem.
And those ties to community, they keep with them for the rest of their career. Look at Brian Williams, for example, who started in local, and that beginning, although I guess he's not the most popular person right now, but that beginning, allowed him to cover Sandy very well, right?
So, this last, there's a recent development I think has some significance I'd like to talk about before we open up to questions from the floor. And it's this civic information bill that recently passed after what was essentially a 3-year organizing effort in New Jersey. And the genesis of that discussion was what to do with proceeds from the auction of public radio licenses for wireless assets as a part of the FCC's spectrum auction. Something like $300+ million was generated from those state licenses that the state of New Jersey operated for a couple of public radio stations. And our colleagues at Free Press asked the question, gee, it would be great if you actually had some public benefit for the use of public resources, right? And that you had some endowment, or you had some future vision for the sustenance of civic information. And that really was sort of the core of that organizing effort. So last week, I think it was, the state of New Jersey codified, I think it's a small amount of money for the entire state. It was $5 million, basically to begin to set up a system that actually looks at sustaining localism and local information within the state. What does that portend, do you think? What's your perspective on that? I'm just kind of curious from all three of you here.
I'll dive in first because we were actively involved in that initiative, and also the News Voices project I mentioned is a Free Press project. So they launched that in New Jersey and have been doing that for years, and by building up those community ties and connections and trust, which we haven't mentioned, but trust is key, that they were able to use that trust to build support for this project, this separate project. So I think that is your point, that it was 3 years, that the public television licenses, this has been a long time coming and it took a lot of work. But one of the things that we, both government, but also peer funders and the philanthropy community are constantly trying to be evangelists for is to say that local news and information is a public good. And this is something that we need to think about how to support. So maybe it's through initiatives like the $5 billion civic project that's setting up this really interesting new organization that's going to work collaboratively across the state. Or maybe it's working with foundations locally to think that this is key to all the things that you want to help change in your community, whether it's health or education or otherwise. You can't have all that stuff without news and information. So it's a good sign. It's $5 million. It's a start. So we'll see where we can go from there.
Yeah, it's not an ending, we would hope, right? Because it doesn't solve the problem. Right. Melanie, what are you going to say?
Yeah, it's been interesting having been in the newspaper industry and outside it. Things always look different when you're on one side or the other. But there's been some consternation from people in commercial media about how you shouldn't take money from government for news. But I think that fails to understand news as part of the broader society. If you consider that government funding goes to state government funding goes to lots of different industries, right? Industries that are in struggle or collapse to help retrain workers and so on. It goes to arts, it goes to history, it goes to all kinds of things that we consider public benefit. So I think the idea of a government grant to the New York Times may be one thing, but the idea for helping an important part of the civic fabric recover from disruption and go forward, and just to provide civic information, which is a different thing related to news, but it's not the same thing. So I think that some of the constructs of the way that the mainstream news industry looks at things sometimes hamper efforts to really reinvent, especially local news and information.
And I'm going to open up to questions. We've got in a moment or two, there's a microphone here in the middle, and I invite people to bring questions for our panel here in a moment. But I just kind of give one other observation and a note that I've got to have about our industry. I was recently at a gathering in Sacramento where we were talking about the vital role that our organizations play covering elections. You know, just be able to provide local election coverage, local debate coverage. And we find now that because of broadcast agreements very often, or because in some cases candidates not being interested in having their opponents' views being expressed, that local debates are becoming rarer and rarer for many of our communities. So I would say that it's one of the areas that we typically specialize in. And I was in a gathering, probably about a room about half this size, and a researcher from, I think from the University of California, said something, asked the room, okay, how many people do local elections coverage? Everybody raised their hand. And I asked a follow-up question, how many people have news directors? One. So I think it's a curious issue for us to be thinking about as we're building editorial practice at the local level. We are actually really good at providing civic information, but we don't necessarily have an editorial tradition in our field. We often saw ourselves as facilitators and conduits for civic information. In some instances, we're local governments, or we're school districts. In some cases, we're nonprofits at the local level. So I would say, I mean, I've seen Mike Johnson in the room here. Mike Johnson has a news director. Right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about the news practice. I mean, I think I can name on a couple hands places that have newsrooms in our field. I'm not sure if CTV from Prince George's County, Maryland is here in the room. They do a daily newscast, and they have a news director. And they're, again, in the exurban community, just outside of D.C., across the Maryland border. And the reason I think they devote their resources to news practice is because their community is often misrepresented or not represented at all in the Washington Post or in the daily press, or even with WAMU, the local public radio station, which I think provides excellent coverage of civic life in the D.C. metro area. But I will tell you that when Prince George's comes up as a subject matter, it's often something awful. Right? And I think that's the experience that many of our communities have is a need for self-determination that I think comes from our organizations. And I think that's something I think that we can bring to the table. And I know that's been the case for your experience in the northwest suburbs of Minneapolis, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about your experience here during our Q&A, Mike. Let me ask if people want to have questions for our discussions. I can, I did talk radio for something like 20 years, so I'm more than happy to just sort of spin bullshit for the next 45 minutes. I would more rather hear from the assembled crowd here. And Teresa, I don't know if you could say something.
Oh, I'll just respond really quickly to your comment about news directors and newsrooms. I think one of the mistakes that we make is in thinking about setting up journalistic intent and setting up covering of our communities is that we need to replicate what happened before. So I think there are certainly ethical things that we should follow around journalistic ethics, but do we need to set up a newsroom like our local TV station? I'm not sure. So I think that we need to keep that into account, that we're not trying to set up what happened before. This is a chance for something new.
And go ahead, Aziz.
I would just add to that there's something valuable, I think, about having news directors or the equivalent on staff and who can provide some sort of editorial guidance and training. But I also think that it's really valuable and really important that we're engaging passionate amateurs and people from the community who want to tell stories and working really with them in order to tell stories about their community, not just telling stories about their community without them.
And maybe we could. You tell Josh that we mentioned him a couple times during the course of this panel, Teresa, my former colleague, Josh Stearns at Free Press, before he joined the Democracy Fund, has a sort of a favorite expression, and that's committing acts of journalism. Right? Is that there may be journalists who do that journalistic work, but there are people who can do journalism all across America who commit those acts, and I think that's a sort of a really nice thing to be thinking about as we're building that practice across the country. It can live in many different forms, and it can really be many different audiences that we're engaging. So. Anyway, identify yourself and
most common name in the phone book, Mike Johnson, right here. Anyway, yes, we do have a news director. We've been doing this for about 15, 20 years at least. We haven't really talked a little bit about delivery and the new model of how things are done, but I want to implore everybody in this room, I think Jay April said the same thing last year when we were in Sacramento, that if you're not encoding content and getting that delivered, whether on Facebook, YouTube, or directly sent to your core group of people, your stakeholders, you're setting yourself up for failure, because we cannot, I repeat to everybody in this room, we cannot rely entirely on appointment view television. We're in a totally different universe now. You look at all the things going on over the top. And so what we've been doing, it's like, think about a band when they first start out, a local band. They've got a grassroots effort to, like, hey, get followers to go to the local bar or whatever and see them play. And we have done the same thing. We started out years ago building a list. I mean, basically, we have a telemarketing list through GovDelivery, where we do email blasts every single week to all of our stakeholders of the list that we put together, whether it's every city council member, every local congressman representing us, I mean, Senator Amy Klobuchar's office, all the Chamber of Commerce people, librarians, anybody you can think of, commissioners, all of those people, if you put them on a list and email blast content that they might be interested in, they will view it. Because we're averaging several 100,000 views a month because we've built this audience. We don't know what we really have. I mean, we did some quasi-scientific surveys back maybe 5 to 10 years ago on our cable. We have about 70,000 subscribers. And we were up there in that, like, we rated amongst, like, the headline news and some of these second and third tier cable channels. But I just implore everybody to build an audience and get that content delivered, and that's why you need to grow your Facebook followers, your Twitter followers, anything you can do, whether it's email marketing, you need to do it, and you need to do it constantly. And if you can, even if you're just doing a couple, just little snippets here and there, it needs to be sent out. Because if you think people are going to sit there and go, I'm going to watch this show at 9 o'clock, when you think about the 150 or 200 channel universe, it's not going to happen. You need to get it out there, and if you can get it to the right people at the right time, people will watch it. It's like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you create that content for specific audiences, different groups of people, they will watch it.
I mean, this is sort of this question of, like, how you build audience and connect with audience that I think faces a lot of the organizations that you're working with, right?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about the need for more local news and information, but who cares if no one's looking at it and no one can find it? So I think that's the pitfalls that a lot of these new news organizations are facing. They're setting things up and no one's coming to see it. So we talk a lot about distribution and thinking about building audience through perhaps. One thing is you don't have to do it alone. So is there someone in your community that has a different medium that you could be collaborating with? I know it's really, is there a newsletter or the listserv that you could be getting on every week and thinking about that? I think there's a lot of innovations in delivery that need to be talked about more. So yes, building your social media channels, but I think email lists are really important both for content, but also if you're building membership and things like that. There's examples like Outlier Media in Detroit is using text messaging to connect with audiences, to give them information directly. There's things like the Charlotte Agenda, which started an email newsletter program and is going gangbusters in terms of that's their whole business model, setting up this email newsletter. So think about different ways you can connect, but don't think about how you connect to news. talk to some other people, and maybe, do an informal group where you just sit down and get to know how other people connect to news, because that's the fatal flaw in a lot of people's initiatives, that they just make something great and then nobody looks at it.
I describe that as the underwear pants gnome problem. If you're a South Park fan, the gnomes collect underpants. There's step 2. Step 3 is profit, right?
Yeah, well, one thing that, you're looking back, that, the internet didn't change media. The internet changed everything. And I think the mistake was seeing it as another way to deliver, just a delivery channel for the same. And that was obviously the newspaper industry is one of the many mistakes the newspaper industry made. And so understanding how people live, how they're getting information, how they're using channels, how you participate there. So, a lot of Instagram users are complaining because suddenly media companies are showing up with their stuff, in these promoted feeds. So, it's not one thing I love about this gathering and talking to Mike is how there's no one model. There's no one uniform community. There's no one need. So understanding who your people are and who other partners are in the community who might embed your content, who might carry that message for you, and how that relates to in-person gatherings and so on, and creating that kind of thing that your community needs. That's what's exciting to me about your station.
And I think one of the practices I like to, and please come up to the podium for questions for our panel. One of the practices that I'm really struck by with watching your work, Aziz, this comes from my experience when I was working in St. Paul, is the partnership work we did with Ethnic Press, which is a host of institutions that very often are nonprofit, sometimes for-profit, local businesses, just kind of hustling to get by. Sometimes they're startups, sometimes they're historically based in community. But extending their reach, extending their use, and extending their capacity is something I think that Ethnic Press desperately needs. And I think there's a huge potential for us to be thinking about partnership work with Ethnic Press to be able to extend that work. We started a project actually with African American Press, Insight News in St. Paul, where we were doing a series of legislative discussion forums that are happening. We did it at a cafe, basically. It was a talk show at a cafe. But Insight News would then write an article about the issues behind the discussion, and then the embedded video would be able to be played on their website. We'd show the program on our channels, and then we'd also take an audio version and run it on a community radio station. So we were doing sort of like a full-court press with information to be able to reach people in many different ways. This is about 16, 17 years ago back in St. Paul. But we did the same thing with Asian American independent press in the Twin Cities, Latin American press in the Twin Cities, Somali press, which is and Hmong press in the Twin Cities. And again, these are all institutions that care desperately about, I guess the way I would think about it is you're thinking about allies to be building work in. These are people who I think historically would be identified as public intellectuals that care about the life of their community, desperately in some cases, to be able to empower their community and grow their community. And they should be your partners, even though they may be for-profit businesses and they may be working in a different specific form. I think there's a huge potential for partnership across the country in small and large communities that we could be pointing to. You want to say something, Aziz, to that effect?
No, I totally agree with you. Also, we're blessed in New York to have a center CUNY has a center for ethnic and community media, who we work very closely with on a number of projects. But the other, and there's another advantage when we're talking about distribution and audience growth. When we fired up the Brick TV brand, that specific channel 3 years ago, we didn't have any audience, and the way that we grew it was through partnerships. It was the only way to grow it, frankly, is through aligning and associating and working with organizations that do have large followings. And But to your point about ethnic press, you know, one of the first pieces that we did that kind of went viral was a film on a gentleman who was part of the Hasidic community in Brooklyn and who left that community and some of the struggles that he faced, considering his the holes in his education. It was just one of many pieces that we had done, and it went completely viral. And the reason we realized when we looked at where the viewers were coming from is that not only did the entire Yiddish and Hebrew language publications in New York and then the rest of the U.S. pick it up, but so did all of them in Israel. Yeah. So all of a sudden we had this very large...
You've got a diaspora community that's embracing content.
And that was clearly being underserved by English language content, right? So that was a cool lesson to learn. And
yeah, we did a lot of work with mental health professionals in the Somali community in the Twin Cities, because particularly with the diaspora there, the entire idea of questions of mental health were culturally alien to them. And many of the health problems that they encountered as they became American citizens in the last 25 years after the Civil War, they really are about sort of changes in their lives as new Americans. We did a series of mental health programs with professionals and practitioners in the Somali community. And actually we did television drama was the form, because that was actually the storytelling form that a lot of Somalis know as an oral culture. It is the first video ever done on mental health in Somali worldwide. Mm-hmm. It was seen in 25 countries and is still used as an educational resource in Denmark and Sweden, Canada, across the United States. And that was because we saw a need in our community.
And that kind of storytelling is evergreen.
Correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yeah. Were we doing news? Probably not. Were we providing vital civic information that lives in the lives of Americans in our community? Certainly.
Yeah.
One thing I'll just add, if you're new to thinking about working with ethnic media and ethnic press, there's a lot of good resources the American Press Institute has. Daniela Gerson, who is now the co-head of the community for ethnic media in New York, has written some really good resources there, especially around how to partner equally. So I think that you might have had experience with this with other outlets, that partnerships with ethnic media can be really extractive. So I'm sure that has been your experience when you've worked with other big organizations. So thinking about how to really respect those organizations, some really good tips and advice there.
Let's go to another question from the audience. Please identify yourself.
Peter Helland. I'm with Citizens for Community Media out of South Bend, Indiana. I was reading an article that said there was a study that 31% of Americans think there's going to be a civil war within the next 5 years. And we're in Baltimore, so you have 1812, and then you have 1861. So the potential that everything that you're saying, or anybody's saying, is they're coming from one camp or another. In other words, people are going to analyze, well, where are you coming from? Well, it could be which side of the Civil War. And public access television, usually 50% of the shows, maybe, are coming from churches. Okay, so now you know that that's a certain ideology. But then historically, I perceive that public access stations tend to be more liberal, because if you go through grade school, high school, journalism tends to be a little bit more liberal. So what's your opinion on this kind of cultural divide? Because anytime you report or nobody can be neutral, even though supposedly journalism is somewhat neutral. Otherwise it's yellow journalism, right? So how do you feel this tension? Or do you sense this tension, that there is, this little uneasiness going on in the country? And then how do you feel public access stations participate in that?
Yeah,
well, earlier Mike asked the question of what's the real damage that's happening when local media is being eroded, and I think this is actually a very concrete example of real damage. If this many people, believe that we're headed for a civil war. I also, if we look at just this morning I read a headline that said that the percentage of people who believe that the Earth is flat has never been higher in the history of the country. So that's kind of weird, and it's kind of scary. And I think that, the Columbia Journalism Review came out with this study that said that only 20% of Americans believe or trust the mainstream media, whereas 70% believe or trust their local news, right? So if you lose all of these trustworthy news sources, then we start believing that we're headed for a civil war or that the Earth is flat. And I actually don't think that that's very productive, and I don't think it's a situation where it's a right or wrong scenario. I think that if we tell stories and tell stories honestly and tell stories with our community, whether they're from a church or from an activist group, then we all benefit, and maybe we stop believing that there's a civil war and we stop believing that the Earth is flat.
The Earth isn't flat. So, I will put an asterisk here and say that I've never lived through times quite like this before, and so I think that you tend to bring your past experience to anything you do, but sometimes you have a failure of the imagination in understanding how different things are from the way you thought they were. But I do know that people like to see facts for themselves, and they like to make up their own minds. And I think that local news has often, even with national issues, sort of put it on a local level. The healthcare law passes, how's this going to work in your state or community? A lot of that's being lost also. But I think that discussion, that kind of sense of making sense of things, bringing people together, I think that's an opportunity for community media. There's no doubt that mainstream journalism has been liberal historically, and since at least the whole time I grew up in. And that was something that, people in mainstream media couldn't just say. There's a kind of a bias towards certain concepts that are liberal progressive concepts. And so, being honest about where you are, who you are, where you're coming from, what you're trying to do, and what you need from the community, I think is an advantage in building trust. And a lot of the organizations that are working on building trust find it gets down to those common sense things. Is somebody straightforward? Are they upfront? Do they show their work? Do they admit when they made a mistake, which has also been a hard thing for a lot of people in media over time?
Yeah, and I'll just add that there's tons of work being done around trust. I think there was some blog post that was like, what are all these different trust projects and what the heck are they doing? Because they all have trust in the name. But it all comes down, I think, to a lot of the things that were mentioned. But I think that it's important to call out the fact that neutral was never neutral, and neutral was from a certain privileged white male perspective often. So I think that's important to really grapple with in the journalistic community. I mean, even that church's example, I think there's some really amazing work being done engaging in faith communities, because that's often where there is trust, or in libraries. So thinking about how we can work with these other institutions to really go to them and go to communities to build that social cohesion, rather than saying, oh, that we don't get involved in that. So.
Hi, Frank Gervasi. I'm from Greenbelt Access Television, right here in PG County, next county down. Amy Goodman said it great last night. She put it that whole landscape of commercial television and what we have in cable is everything to sell and nothing to tell. Mm-hmm. And that's our great advantage, because we can't sell anything. We're here to tell things. And how we do it and how we tell people that we are telling them is our big challenge. And it kind of shook me a little bit when you said that you had a room full of people like this and they only had one newsroom, that were really devoted to telling the news, whether you tell it through amateurs, like you were saying, that get help, but to tell the news. And we're blessed to have CTV with us. We're working with them a little bit. Yeah. We hope to work more, and we hope to grow our own news local. My wife's a retired print journalist. She, with the decline of newspapers, local news, our journal newspapers had a whole range. They've all gone out of business. So it's really up to us, I think, to continue that, to really fill in the gap. And how we do it, and this alliance gives me a lot of hope, too, because we're meeting, I get to meet people from Bowie and from other stations that are around. One of the big things she was talking about last night is all these kids that were kidnapped and where they're going. Well, right here in Maryland, we have a site in Crofton, which is in Bowie, and that's where they're holding some of these kids. And that's the kind of news we need to be talking about, too, because that's what everybody's interested in. And we can do that. We don't have to be censored by Fox or some crap that's telling us, well, you can't really say anything about that. Just let's whitewash it.
The one thing I can kind of respond to this, because this is also something that I brought up to the crew before our discussion today, and I think it's just something that we need to navigate and understand ourselves as we tell our story as institutions. To be fair, public access does not have strong histories of editorial voice. We were conduits for other people's voice. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about as we're building muscles, as we're building program arms, not necessarily to get rid of a public access tradition if you're public access programming. It's certainly also true if you're government access, or as in many organizations, you're a mixed operation. We actually see this in a lot of smaller communities and counties where it's a government entity that does it all, right? It's a government employee that makes sure, like a librarian, that public information is available to everybody and people have a voice. So there aren't really strong sort of sets of traditions there about, like, what does a government official do for building editorial tradition? How does that work in America? I mean, other countries have got stronger traditions than that than we do, certainly. And we could be learning some lessons. So I just think that, owning those traditions, thinking about those values, and then thinking about what you're trying to build is extremely important in that work, Frank. That's my perspective as you're talking about building better media in a place like Greenbelt, or even just outside of Greenbelt in Hyattsville.
Sure. Our expanded community. And somebody said it earlier that the news from Prince George's County is usually horrible, because that's a good friend of mine was a news guy for years, and all he would do was chase ambulances and chase just all the bad news. So if the commercial station's putting out all the bad news, who's putting out the good news? And it's all news. This is news, so I don't think we should look at education as not being the news. Education is history, and it's the news. And that's our mission anyway.
Thank you.
I think.
Well, Mike, you said something in our conversation that, in the holding accountable, there's different ways to do that. And so there's a public radio station in Raleigh that WSHA, historically black private college, that the station has just been sold to a Christian broadcaster. But for years it's had, every week, they have the labor commissioner, state labor commissioner on, the state attorney general comes on. They do weekly shows on the station where they just talk to the host and answer questions from the community. Yeah. And you can bring people in for conversation with the community. It's a different model, as Teresa said, from having a news director and covering council meetings, but there are a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have to all be bad stuff, too. It could be things that are really hopes and aspirations, things that people are working on, trying to accomplish, lots of things.
Just one other reflection as we get to the next question here from the floor. I visited operation in Cabarrus County, just outside of Charlotte earlier this year, and it's a so-called G channel. They do community. They self-identify as a community channel. They don't do public access necessarily, but they do community content, and they're interested in news partnerships. And the guy who runs the place, his dream is to have at least weekly talk show from a local cafe, where basically community leaders come forward, talk about the life of what's happening in the county, and you're gonna hate me for saying this, and they read obituaries. And what's that about? Why would you? Well, it's because, you think about, you get together at a barber shop or you get together at a cafe in America, what do you do? Did you hear about Fred? Did you hear about Gladys? I mean, they had an incredible life. And it's like this entire thing. It's like what, you're catching up with your family, right, in a certain extent. If you use a different metaphor, it's a very, very different type of community storytelling that's happening in a place like rural North Carolina.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely.
But that's legitimate.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be thinking about ways in which we can be embracing that type of creativity, be helping the community understand itself. Go ahead, John, and identify yourself and give us a question.
John Wetmore. I produced the series Perils for Pedestrians. When you had a local newspaper, you'd have someone assigned to City Hall, someone assigned to the school board, and so on. In a public access environment, it's whatever people happen to be interested in, which might be kind of random, and maybe nobody's interested in covering what the school board's up to. How can public access station, are there any good examples of how you can sort of target these major holes in what randomly comes in?
I can catch and deflect if I can. Just kind of pass. I'll do it like an assist here. I'll try to do my best John Wall here. So I'm going to catch the ball and try to deflect it. I think probably what that means is you have to do an assessment of where the dominant and strong media is in your community and what's missing. And then you need to be investing resources in those holes, those gaps. So I think that means some type of community mapping or community information mapping exercise that occurs to be able to think about things that you're investing in. When I was in St. Paul, we did a lot of nonprofit partnership just because we saw ourselves as as leaders within the civic environment, and we thought that nonprofit civic information is important in the life of the community. And we ended up relying a lot upon our partners to tell us about what their needs were, if they were doing community health work, or they're doing housing work, or they're doing economic development work. So having that sort of community mapping exercise at some point is extremely important. I don't know if you can speak to those experiences, but I think probably you all have some insight on that.
Yeah, I think we benefit from two things. One is, Anthony Riddle, who runs Brick Community Media and runs a number of programs, all of which touch our community in very different ways. Because of that, we've got a very comprehensive kind of picture of the borough and the community that we live in, and we touch them from education and library programs. And so, I think Brick is an advantage in which we are very kind of ingrained in the community. And then the other is kind of trial and error. If we're following our metrics and we do a story and it strikes a nerve and people really respond to it, then we know, oh, look, we've got to do more stories about school segregation, for example, which was a really big story for us last year, and which I, frankly, had no idea would strike a nerve. I was like, oh, school segregation.
This is probably the challenge of a producer in any type of environment, is you've got to go beyond yourself.
Yeah.
Right? I can't tell you how many times I've talked to producers like, oh, none of my friends care about that issue, so the issue doesn't exist. Right? So you've got to find some type of tripwire or some type of source point that goes beyond yourself to be able to do those stories, right?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
I'll add Jay Rosen, who's at NYU, and I'm working with on the Membership Puzzle Project. He talks about the difference between troubles and issues. And issues are, people think of as public concerns, and it's what media talk about a lot. Issues, it's kind of not so personal. Troubles are personal. And a lot of the coverage in the media is of issues, which is why a lot of people think that news is about other people. It's not really about my life. But I think you think about the troubles that keep people up at night, that when you talk about with your friends about what's going on, health is often near the top. Your children, your family, the things that are closest. So if you think about those those issues you mentioned, and you think about in your community, who's doing things and where are the things that people want to talk about, that might be a different way of organizing what you cover. And it might not require setting up a full-time school board reporter. Now, watchdog reporting is really important, and one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is like, how do you get communities to fund watchdog reporting? Because people want it and rely on it, but not every institution can or needs to be in that model, and organizations have to. What was it you said? Your superpower, embrace your superpower.
Yeah.
Right?
What's your superpower?
So being close to the community means you're closer to those things that are in people's hearts and minds, and you can respond by maybe going deep on one particular aspect of what's going on in the schools, and bring a lot of people in to talk about it, and get expertise, and so on. So.
There was actually a really cool project at a public radio station in Tennessee, and then a station in Rochester, New York is doing it now, where they just ask people what keeps you up at night.
Yeah.
And they went around to, farmers markets and went around town and had people fill in Post-its, and they pulled them all together. And then it was a really engaging and interesting project, but then they also used it to pick, we're going to do a series on mental health because everyone answered this, and we don't have a health reporter. So it was a really interesting way to get at, like, how do we pick one thing to test? So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I also think about to give you another example, and we'll get to the next question. An old friend of mine who used to work at my community radio station, Jesse Hardman. He's done this great series of projects. He's based in New Orleans, and he found that the best way to do community engagement was put signs up with little numbers, the little tags up on a phone pole.
Yeah.
Right?
I love that.
Like, why are there potholes in this neighborhood?
Yeah.
What's going on? And then basically he'd do a series of 5-minute reports based upon the engagement he gets back from people in the community.
Yeah.
And it's a way to be able to get beyond yourself in terms of beats. It was basically sort of a neighborhood beat type of project. But just like if you're a fisherman or woman, you fish where the fish are. Yeah. And if you're a street singer, you busk on a corner where people want to listen to you. So for Jesse, it was getting a staple gun, getting flyers, call this number. And that was the way he engaged with the community. And I used to work with him about 20 years ago at KFAI, and I was kind of gobsmacked when I saw this project.
That's great.
And he said, "Mike, you're the one who inspired me to do this stuff. So you should be surprised." I mean, I think we all have this kind of ability to be able to be creative to engage with other people. Mm-hmm. And I think I would ask you to embrace that as you're thinking about that work. Please come up to the mic.
Rick Elrod from Fairfax County, Virginia. I was thinking about the description of public access as an editorial voice and as a conduit for other people's voices. And that strikes me as two quite different concepts of public access. I was trying to follow that out. As soon as you have an editorial voice, you're going to take a position. You're assuming a particular standpoint, and that's different from the kind of all the community gets to speak kind of thing. And I was thinking about how the people with various extreme views that I see on Facebook, for example, would react to the public access channel's voice. And that led me to wonder about, okay, so as far as that goes, you're going to start yourself in somewhere. As far as the conduit part of it, it led me to wonder, how many of us, as far as the public, the general public, people who produce shows, how do they break down into, say, liberal versus conservative? Or are they equally balanced, or do you tend to get more of one than the other? Someone mentioned churches. I'm not sure that falls into either camp necessarily. But how do you find the public that comes in to produce shows breaks down in terms of viewpoints?
So the question is, how do you get the public voice if you have an editorial voice? Is that, am I getting that right?
I was.
Or is there a necessary conflict with public voice?
Well, I understand. That's kind of the premise, but the question is, when you have people come in to make shows, do they tend to be equally, equal 50% liberal, 50% conservative, or do they skew to one side or the other? As far as that conduit part, does that part skew as a rule?
Right. So I think that public access has always traditionally helped people tell their stories, right? Either through the technology or the equipment or the space or the expertise that we provide. That's, the idea that, we can do that, especially now in a YouTube age where anybody with a cell phone can make their own show and go online. I think that part of this idea is what do we offer to that in that scenario? And one of the things I think we can offer is journalistic rigor and editorial rigor. Just one of the things. I think we can offer a lot of things, but one of the things we try at least to offer at Brick TV when we work with people to tell their stories is good practices and templates, and we do a lot of, for example, roughly 5-minute short documentaries that have a structure and have a template and have a system that people can follow in order to tell the story that they want to tell in a way that might be very manageable and promotable and on social media. It doesn't necessarily mean we're telling them you have to be a Republican on this issue or you have to be a Democrat on this issue. It just means that we are telling them you have to check your sources and you have to make sure that that you're not repeating like a conspiracy theory, or that, what I mean? It's more, I think, that with an editorial voice and having an editorial department, which we do, and having a newsroom, which we are fortunate to have, is about kind of providing that rigor rather than an ideological filter, if that makes any sense.
And I've got two other responses here. One is just a practical response, and then one is more of a strategic response. The practical response is that it's important. I mean, I think it's certainly important for 501c3 organizations to make sure they articulate electioneering guidelines and political guidelines for their coverage to maintain neutrality in election and any type of political campaigning that occurs. I mean, going beyond the strategic need to be able to maintain good relationships with municipal or county government, you need to be able to have clear, strong political content guidelines in terms of what your resources are as an organization go toward. I mean, we had that when I was at SPNN, and we gave that out to everybody as a public guideline. We did not electioneer, we treated candidates fairly in competitive races, all those types of things. That ensures, just from the strict sort of political balance question you get to. And the other thing I'd say to you is that we need to be, as community media makers, we need to be less in the hammer industry, and we need to have a toolbox. Public access is a hammer. It's a specific tool, a specific set of procedures in terms of first come, first serve, resources, and the like. As a community media maker, I need to have a big-ass tool belt. Mm-hmm. I got a hammer. I got and the thing I would just say to you is that there are a series of different community media practices that we need to be inculcating in our communities, and that an organization needn't just have one practice in one department. Right? And so growing those practices and growing those traditions, I think, obviates this question of whether or not you're you're just a political tool, if I can extend my metaphor a little. Rick never does puns, so it's okay. Yeah, anyway. One last question from the floor, and then we'll wrap up here. Go on ahead.
Hello, my name is Antoine Haywood, and I'm from Philly Cam in Philadelphia, PA. And I think this perhaps is easy. You can address this question. One thing that we've been grappling with is we have a monthly news program called Philly Cam Voices, and we've contracted a person. We have 2 people contracted who come in and do like this editorial role, if you will. But they're working with our members to actually produce these news stories on a regular basis. We also have a show called Atrevete, which is a monthly news program for Spanish-speaking communities. One thing that we're dealing with, though, is figuring out how to facilitate like the culture of practice on this like consistent basis with people who, as you were saying, like are amateurs. They have this high level. They're really hyped to be involved in like this way and to produce news. But then we have people who are facilitating these programs that are actual professionals, and sometimes their expectations don't line up a lot, right? So can you just speak a little bit more in terms of like some best practices or things that we should be thinking about in terms of helping that like coexistence of people who have this professional experience build up the skills and the practitioner culture of like community members?
Sure. I'm going to answer metaphorically, if that's okay.
We like metaphors. We like metaphors. Yeah.
I read once that there's a pottery teacher in Vermont, and he had 2 classes. In one of the classes, he said, "Okay, you're going to make 60 pots throughout the year, and you get graded on your best 3 pots." And that's it. Everyone gets an A as long as you make 60 pots. And the other class, it's like, okay, you're going to spend the whole year just making 3 amazing pots. And you're going to do all the research and do everything like that. And he did this for a few years, and every single year, the group that made the 60 pots and trashed the other 57 were always superior to the class that just made the 3 pots. And I think that's kind of been our approach, is let's make a lot of content. Let's be okay if not all of it is great. Let's learn from our mistakes. Maybe all of it doesn't do everything we want it to do. Maybe some of it doesn't really work. But if we make a lot of content, what happens is, first of all, we get a lot of really good content because the best stuff really rises to the top and it's awesome. And second of all, those producers who we've been working with start to become really good producers. And so I think I think that's our answer, is like, let's not be afraid to mess up, and let's not be afraid to fail, and let's not be afraid to just make a lot, and then hopefully we can figure it out as we go.
We've just about run out of time. Before we go, I need to plug your work that happens every Friday. Easily the best thing that I get about local news across America on a regular basis. So it's my personal endorsement. Tell everyone about the Local Fix, Teresa.
Sure. Check's in the mail for that one. Local Fix, you can find it at tinyletter.com/localfix and subscribe. Comes every Friday. Usually, but every Friday you'll get it in your. Yeah, we're pretty good. We're pretty good. You'll get it in your inbox every Friday. It's written by me and Josh Stearns, and where we cover everything and anything related to local news. And one of the things that I know is that there's so much information out there, and so our role is to curate, give you the bits that you need to know, give you some insights, some tools and tips, and then make it really useful for people thinking about these issues. So I'm also really interested in feedback and ideas, so if you have things you want in there, please come and share them with me. I'm really looking forward to getting those.
And then before we go, one other thing, you're going to be part of the discussion that's happening this afternoon with the Local News Partnership discussion that Erica Jones is curating, which will be happening, I think, at 1:45. So it'll be a chance to have some deeper discussion in a smaller group environment. So please join us for that. I know, Aziz, you'll be around here through the course of the conference. And I think, Melanie, you're going to be here as well to be able to connect with people. Please, let's hear it for our panelists today. And before we release you, we'll be going to a break here. Please enjoy some coffee, some more coffee, because that dance party was great last night. A couple of the quick program notes. The great Joseph Torres will be joining us for the Inclusion, Equity, and Engagement Caucus to talk about media diversity at 11 o'clock, so please join us for that. If you're interested in those issues, Joe's a fabulous, fabulous researcher and an inspiration to me, so I hope you get a chance to join us. Also join us for the membership luncheon, where we'll be talking about the work of ACM, so that's open to all members, so please join us for that at 12 noon. And enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thank you so much, everybody.